welcome back to my channel and the next in the series of the how-tos and whens for vermicomposting. So I've been filming this all in one session, and we started out with these trays needing to be harvested, and then we've looked at how to store those castings, then what bedding to use, and I had to mix a tray with another because of how these castings were clumping, put some more bedding in, and now the final thing to do is to feed. And so we're going to talk about what to feed, because as I've mentioned, I came to this from running huge muck heaps. And so, of course, as a composter, I haven't really given much thought about what to feed worms in a tower or a bin. Of course, I just composted all the things apart from meat and cooked foods. And so in my research, I came across various different things and what turned out to be a few myths. And so when it comes to kitchen scraps, to me, all things seemed logical, except I came across things like don't feed allium family and don't feed citrus, and I was like, oh, okay, you know, these are the people, they've been doing this for a while, so you take it for granted that that's what happens. Except a bit later on I started questioning that. In fact, I even repeated that knowledge in some of my first videos, but I didn't actually question it at the time, which is quite unusual for me because that's something I normally do, and I go off and I research it a bit deeper. But what surprised me when I thought about it later was why I hadn't, because not only have I done vermicomposting in these big heaps of mine, but I've also done it in ground. And I don't mean putting a bucket in the ground and then, you know, feeding in a bucket, but I mean actually composting directly in the ground and on top of it. You know, as a no-dig gardener, I like to encourage the worms and the microbes around the plants, because that's what we're doing vermicomposting for. It's to encourage the microbes, because these castings, it's not a fertilizer. We're actually after the microbes. We're actually after this ecosystem, because that's what the plants do. The plants, they have this symbiotic relationship with the ecosystem under the ground, which is why I do no dig. I don't want to destroy that ecosystem. I want to promote it. And not only that, but I have a huge issue with cats around here who all seem to think that my garden is the most perfect place to go to the loo. Now, I'm highly allergic to cats, but I don't want to harm them. And so, you know, when I've been researching the best way to keep cats out of my garden, obviously I'm going to go for the most natural things, and citrus and coffee grounds are one of them. So imagine my surprise when I'm told don't feed citrus to your worms. But I put citrus peels all over my garden, and when I move them to do other things like putting plants in the garden, the worms are always there. Now, I'm not saying that you should put a ton of onion peel or garlic or tons of citrus into your bins, but I do feel that some of these things are a bit of a myth, because once the microbes have broken these things down, I think worms will pretty much eat anything, because they're not eating all these fruits and vegetables and everything else directly. They're after the microbes and everything else that are breaking these things down. They're all part of an ecosystem. So to that end, what do we feed them? Well, for instance, today I've got an avocado that's going bad, and I know they love these, and I want my worms to clump together because it's cold. Now, usually I'd be feeding in trenches going across, and I alternate where I do it because I want the worms to work through this. But this is a small confined space. So in the winter, I feed in the middle, and then they can get around the edge if they want, but obviously it's cold around the edge. So if they're in the middle, where this degrading food creates some heat, hopefully, where the microbes are breaking it down, they can get in this and they can form a little worm ball and they can go in there. Now the other thing that I've got in my kitchen caddy are various different bits of food, and this is all chopped up. Now here's the other trick about this. The smaller you chop up your food, the quicker it breaks down. And if you freeze it, that bursts all the cells and it'll break down even quicker. Now the thing about freezing is that it needs to thaw, and that usually creates a lot of fluid. So do bear that in mind when you're putting that in here. Now I'm not going to put in too much because obviously this is already a very wet heap, and you know, I've got to monitor that. So I'm going to come back in here pretty soon to monitor this. Also because I've got something else I want to put in here. Now you want to put in here this avocado. That skin is a very, very slow food. It will be in here for an exceptionally long time, not just because it's winter, but that flesh, that's exceptionally quick food. It's like eating candy, whereas that, yeah, that's the vegetables they don't want, you know, if we're thinking about children. Most of this is what would be termed slower food as well, especially these stalks. But there's some sweet potato in there and they'll enjoy that. Now I am going to put in quite a lot of this eggshell, and I just dry it and grind it. I've got a version, it's not a NutriBullet, but you know, it's a version of, and I'm going to put a lot of this in here, much more than I normally would do, but because it's a wet bin, I want that in there, and quite a lot of it, because it helps out the worms and it helps to keep a more neutral environment. Now here, I've shown this before, this is my homemade worm chow, and I do have a video for this that I've shot of how I made it, but when I went to go and edit it, there's no sound on it. So I'm sorry, but I've yet to edit it and I've yet to do a voiceover for it. And as I've explained in other videos, I've been exceptionally ill. I've had flu and a chest infection, so I've yet to do that. So I do apologise, but it is on its way. So we're just going to give them a little sprinkling of that, and again, because this is high protein and high fat, I'm only giving them a little bit, but this is another reason why we want that eggshell in. Anything that's got high calcium, and I'm just going to give that a mix like that and cover them up. That's one of those tunnels for them to get into. Now I've already done the other tray, so this one will sit straight on top of that so I can get this tower back together, because I am exceptionally cold. But the other thing I have to put in this, there were barely any worms in that other tray that I harvested from right at the beginning of this series. But like I said, this series has been shot all in one day. Well, morning. You're just seeing it all split up. So they're going into this top tray, because most of them were in the bottom, because like worms outside, they all went down, which was another thing that made that second tray almost impossible to harvest, because lots of the worms were down there and I just couldn't. It was too wet to try and harvest that. So they're all there. A nice little ball. See, there were hardly any in that top one, and it was quite dry. So I was able to get them put in there. I was struggling because my back's killing because it's so cold. And so there we go. They'll now dive down into there, and they are all set, ready for this long, cold winter. And so yeah, so with the food, don't feed too often, don't overfeed. remember that the bedding also counts as food, so if you have to go away, don't worry about them. They'll be quite happy in there. You know, if you feed too much, it will get hot, and you know, you don't want too much in there, because you know, little and often is better. Check after a few days. You know, I've got quite a lot of worms in my tower. I can afford to give them separate feedings. I feed that much, the same that I've just put in there, I've put in another tray, but I'd rather give mine less and more often than give them huge feeds. And even then, because of our humidity, I still do get blooms of mites in here, which, you know, I've had the comment on, well, you know, this acts as a composter, you're going to get composting mites. You know, if it was such a major issue, then I'd take my worms out, give them a wash, and I'd reset it all, but I'd still just put this in my normal composting heap. It's the only thing I'm worried about is because it's indoors. If it was outside, I just wouldn't care, you know, unless they were causing my worms a major issue, which they don't. But, you know, the only thing you need to be looking out for really with these worms is if there's an actual problem with them. Now, normally I might try doing a time lapse for these worms going down, but it is so cold, and even with the light, they're not going down. So what I'm going to do is, I'm actually going to bury them, because they have been sat around for a little while, and I am a little concerned for them. You know, I do love my worms. So yeah, so I'm sorry. I'd love to give you a little time lapse, but you know, they are cold and they're not moving, so I'm going to tuck them up in bed. But anything that you eat, I wouldn't put meat in here. I have seen people do experiments with meat and bones and all sorts of things. If you've got an area that's big enough, maybe you want to try experimenting. But if you're new to worms, personally, I wouldn't do that. But what I do know is that in my huge muck heaps, I've had rats get into that, and someone that used to come and take my compost heaps has found the skeletons in there where they've died in there. So who knows? Maybe that's another one of the myths, but it's not something you'd want to do on a regular basis, I don't think, most especially if it's indoors. That would be horrendous. But I'd keep it to just normal kitchen scraps. You're looking for a good balance all the time. That's what I'd go for. But, you know, if you've got bits of citrus and the onion peels and things, I don't think they do any harm. I think it's just, like I said, it's all a case of balance. Same with your bedding, you know, and just monitoring. And if it's working for you, then keep doing it. You know, like I've said in another video, our miles vary, and so work with what you've got. But anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you find it useful, and thank you for watching.